Okay, so because quite honestly, I can't remember what we talked about with regards to care ethics since that was now over a week ago. What I'm going to do is kind of briefly encapsulate some of the major points of care ethics, and then leave it up to the discussion board to for points that you need clarified, right? Like you didn't talk enough about this, you need more of this, something along those lines. Okay, so again, care ethics primarily about feelings and emotions, but the emotions that it's talking about are benevolent feelings, this connection that we have with others. And I'll be using the textbook. I'll also be quoting from David Hume, again, one of the Scottish moral sense theorists who believed that morality is like a sixth sense. And so we just, in our heart and our guts, know the right thing to do. It's not a matter of the intellect. And in many ways, this kind of harkens back to Thomas Jefferson, head versus heart, even though Hume predates Jefferson. Remember, for Jefferson, eventually the heart wins because morals, he says, are too important to be left to the uncertain calculations of the head. So it's not an intellectual thing, it's not reason-based, it's a feelings-based thing. Says David Hume then, talking about a couple of related issues. One, he says, I believe it scarce will be asserted, and the first species of reasoning alone is ever the cause of any action. Its proper province is the world of ideas, right? So he's saying, look, thinking is great, but it has its own sphere, and morality is not it. That morality is in its own sphere, right? That there are limits to reason. That quite frankly, reason doesn't motivate you to really do anything, that you ultimately do what you want to do. You're driven by emotions. And so let's take advantage of that and tap back into these initial feelings and emotions that you have, which are connection to others, benevolence. Later on, he says we have certain instincts, this is David Hume again, originally implanted in our natures, such as benevolence, the love of life, kindness to children, the general appetite to good, the aversion to evil. That's what's implanted in us from the beginning. So then, secondarily, that which comes along later are things like anger and resentment. Hume again says, beside these calm passions which often determine the will, notice the temporal connection here. The emotions come first, the will comes second. And it should for the care ethicist. This is going to be in contrast to some of the other theories that we've talked about or will talk about, where it's reason first and then feelings can come along if it wants to. This is like, no. Feelings first. Then reason comes in to walk out these feelings, right? How then do we show care, concern, compassion, empathy, sympathy, love, so on and so forth, right? But it starts with that initial feeling of those things, these feelings of connection, benevolence, love of life, kindness to children, connection that we have with one another. Like the example I'm pretty sure I mentioned last time about the nursery, right? Where one child starts crying, everyone else starts crying to show basically baby empathy, so the care ethicist would say. These calm passions then often determine the will. That's when we're in the right state of mind. That's when we're not possessed by hunger or anger, loneliness, tiredness, possibly overheatedness, possibly addiction, possibly in love, all these other psychological conditions when we shouldn't be making a decision because it'll probably be a bad one. These calm passions often determine the will, but there are also certain violent emotions which have likewise a great influence on the faculty. So again, reason should be there to get these bad emotions out of the way so that we can act out of the good benevolent ones again. So reason has a twofold job. One, to return us back to this more initial and natural state of connectedness and love and empathy and sympathy. And also then to, once we have this care and empathy and sympathy, what then does that practically look like? How do we walk that out? But it's always, again, secondary to the emotion, the good emotions. It's when I receive an injury from another, when I think that I have been the victim of injustice, then I feel a violent passion of resentment, which makes me desire his evil and punishment. That for the most part, we don't feel wronged. It's only once we feel wronged that we then become consumed by things like anger. And it clouds our judgment, crimes of passion, for instance, right? It clouds our judgment. We're consumed by anger. We're consumed by jealousy. We're consumed by whatever. So we're not in our right state of mind. By right state of mind, what we really mean is our passions are calm. A right state of passions, which then allow us to reason properly. But again, it's feelings first. What we call strength of mind, still David Hume, implies the prevalence of the calm passions above the violent. We call it state of mind, but it's really not. It's really a state of passion instead. Again, passion is what motivates us to actually act. Why most socio-political movements and so forth will show you visuals to bypass the intellect, to hit you in your heart and your guts, right? Certain pictures are meant to make you feel sad because it's when you feel sad that you might do something. The care ethicist would say, overly intellectualized everything to the point where it doesn't really impact us emotionally. And that's not good, that's bad, right? We intellectualize why I shouldn't give to them or do this or do that. But if we tap back into our natural benevolence and love of life, then we're almost compelled to give and to adopt and to do this and to do that. So much so, in fact, this is still David Hume, and I see this is some Shroppy prejudice and bias, I guess. Shroppy sees Hume as in the care ethics sphere. Many other ethicists will place him in the moral nihilist sphere, that they will claim that one type of nihilism is expressivism, that there's nothing to be true and false about, again, like the nihilism we talked about. There's just an expression, oh, torture, ick. Ew, ugh, whatever. I don't like torture. But the care ethicist would say, yes, but that dislike for it, that disgust that you have for it, does point to something greater. It points to the fact that it's unethical. That's why you're disgusted by it. So if you read the first chapter of Burner and Raley, which I did not assign, and I did not assign it precisely for this reason, because Burner and Raley's criteria for what makes for a good ethical theory necessarily excludes care ethics. And by excluding care ethics from a good ethical theory, you're necessarily already placing it much more on the side of something like moral nihilism than something like some of the other ethical theories we're going to talk about, right? And again, this isn't Shroppy being a care ethicist. This is Shroppy trying to give greater voice to care ethics simply because most texts, T-E-X-T-S, most texts give it kind of a backhanded compliments at best. So I'm just trying to equal the playing field here because I'm going to get into the problems too, and there are plenty. So it's against David Hume. Take any action allowed to be vicious, willful murder, for instance. Examine it in all lights and see if you can find that matter-of-fact or real existence which you call vice. In whichever way you take it, you find only certain passions, motives, volitions, and thoughts. There is no other matter of fact in the case. The vice entirely escapes you as long as you consider the object. You never can find it till you turn your reflection into your own breast and find a sentiment of disapprobation, which arises in you toward the action. This disapprobation, this disgust, should be a sign of something greater than just, I don't like. No. The polar bear stranded on the ice is wrong. That's why it makes you feel sad, right? Watching young African-American children being attacked by dogs is horrific. It should make you do something about it, right? In a way that reading a letter that somebody wrote from a jail is not going to, right? The Korean conflict versus the Vietnam conflict. Vietnam conflict, you saw pictures of young boys dying versus the Korean conflict in the newspaper reading a list of names and ages. Hits you completely differently. And so care ethics then is about placing people above something like ideals. The highest ideal here is care, concern, compassion, empathy, sympathy, love, so on and so forth, right? But you're always necessarily caring, compassionate, and empathetic, and sympathetic, and so forth towards people, right? So people really do take priority and precedence here. And this notion of connection and relationships that come to the forefront, right? So this, again, David Hume, just kind of starting by quoting him, and then we'll dig into the Burner and Raley text. Reduce a person to solitude and he loses all enjoyment because the movements of his heart are not forwarded by correspondent movements in his fellow creatures. Again, this connection thing, if you're removed from those connections, if you're removed from community, if you're removed from care and concern and compassion and so forth, that solitude is not good. It'll mess up other stuff. That rehabilitation of all types, be it physical, psychological, emotional, whatever, rehabilitation is sped up and increased by having other living things around, a plant, a pet, a child, another person, right? That there's this interaction. You're moved by correspondent movements of someone else's heart and so forth. Plus plants clear the air and blah, blah, blah. Furthermore, if you have something that you need to take care of, their life is dependent upon you taking good care of yourself, guess what? You're going to take a lot better care of yourself. One of the issues with care ethics, then, where is that line between self-care and care for others? And Berner and Rayleigh get into that towards the end of the chapter. Notice, too, this cut off from connection and so forth is the L, loneliness. Right? Berner and Rayleigh, then. And again, I'm going to steer away from the feminist part. That's part of it, perhaps, but I'd rather focus on the care ethics part rather than the feminist ethics part, because again, I think that does a disservice to males who can show care and concern and compassion, empathy and sympathy and so on and so forth. So I'm looking at, for instance, pages 254 and ongoing. The moral point of universalism is to combat self-centeredness. But care ethics thinks that more universal even than the capacity to reason or something along those lines is the capacity to feel, the capacity to be empathetic and sympathetic towards one another. And again, they think this is more natural as well. So we have to look at younger and younger children to see this play out. Right? So if you look at interactions between young children as compared to interactions amongst teenagers or interactions amongst adults, the care ethicist would have to say, look, you see much more cooperation versus competition. You see much more working with instead of working to defeat or something along those lines. That look at kindergarten classrooms. I mean, the teacher is attempting to foster this idea of community and sharing and working together, which again is what makes kindergarten through the computer so much more difficult, even than other grades through the computer. Principles cannot lead us to think, bottom of 254, about relationships in the right sorts of ways. It's bizarre to speak of a mother's duty to love and cuddle her newborn, or of the husband's duty to lend a sympathetic ear to his wife's story for the day. Yes, people should do these things, but they should just naturally do these things because they care for each other, not because their failing to do so violates some abstract principle. Right? You should do it because you care for. The care comes first. Right? And so it's about, again, fostering these relationships above everything else. So again, stereotypically, gender role, so on and so forth, this kind of ethical family shop he's got rambling around in his head. You know, you got Nietzsche, the adolescent, forget you and your rules, blah, blah, blah. The deontologist, as we have seen or will see, is all about the rules. As long as you're in this house, you're living under these rules, so on and so forth. The care ethicist then is mom, who's trying to be peacekeeper, trying to bring them together. Like, can't we focus on loving one another? And that's going to look different for each individual, right? Which means that you need to know the person that you're caring for in order to care for them properly, in order to care for them in the way that they understand care, concern, compassion, love, empathy, and sympathy. And so, again, excuse me if I've already talked about this, but I'm reminded of the 5 love languages by Dr. Gary Chapman, who says that with regards to all this stuff, there really are like different languages that people speak and understand. Words of affirmation, acts of service, physical touch, gifts, and quality time. Pardon me while I let the cat out. Sorry about that. stuck in the room with me, I didn't know it. And so while we should be caring for everyone, there are some that we're going to care for more than others, right? They're going to be closer to our spheres of compassion and concern and empathy and sympathy and so forth, right? And the closer in you are, so let's say this is me, and here's family and friends or something along those lines, right? The closer in you are, it's not, first of all, I probably do care for you more because we're more closely connected. Secondly, because you're closer to me, then I understand you in a way that I don't understand someone more on the fringes. Right? Again, the environmental movement just wants to place things like the environment and polar bears and stuff here as well. And the idea is that everyone will be part of somebody's circles. It doesn't mean I lack care and concern for anyone. It just means the way that I show that then differs because of where they are, what my relationship looks like with regards to them. But if all of these things are intersecting, then no one's left out. Everyone's receiving care and concern and compassion from someone, hopefully someone close to them, right? The husband then again doesn't have a duty to listen. He cares, and one of the ways he shows he cares is he listens, right? Especially if his wife's love language is words. The guy then has to be receptive to the words that she's saying and be able to reciprocate appropriately. Tell her he loves her because that's how she understands it. That's the language she speaks as compared to something like giving acts of service. That's a different language. She doesn't understand this language as well as she understands this language. If this is her primary love language, for instance, as it is with my wife. Which then raises an interesting question with regards to my chart. And again, care ethics may not fit as well into my chart as some of these other theories do. Obviously, it's feelings-based. We've talked about that. And it's going to be particular acts that count, right? Not overall people. We don't talk about caring people and uncaring people. We talk about caring acts and uncaring acts. But with regards to something like results or intentions, I'm not sure. It probably depends on the care ethicist that you talk to. So I'm going to put a question mark here, but it's going to be a different type of question mark than we had for the relativists. Because on one hand, we could say, well, okay, Shrapi, you know your wife's love language is words of affirmation. So it's on you then to give words of affirmation. Like your acts of service don't cut it. Because you know her and you know how it is that she receives care, you need to learn her language and speak it. Otherwise, you're speaking Portuguese and she understands English, and that's not helpful to her. And so it's once it's received as care. Conversely, some could say, well, you really can't control whether someone understands what you're doing as care. You have intended to care, and that's the best that you can do. That this compassion, sympathy, and empathy, and so on and so forth, that's the thing that you take with you into all situations. And so since it transcends particular situations and particular cultures and so on and so forth, then really it's much more intentions-based. You're intending to show care. That just may look different than they're expecting, which then plays into, is it societal or meta-societal? Right? If it's societal, that tends to tie itself with the results, at least with regards to care ethics. Once it's received, right? Once society understands that this is what caring for them looks like. Or once you understand what that society recognizes as care, versus meta-societal, which is much more intentions, because it doesn't matter what culture you're in, care and concern will still rule the day, though it may look differently. I think related to that is something along the lines of whether your parents have favorite children, or if you are a parent, whether you have favorite children. I mean, some parents I'm sure probably do. I would contend that I do not. I have 3 children. I love them all equally. I do not love them the same. I do not love them the same because they're not the same person. They're 3 distinct individual people. And I know each of them well enough to know how it is that they understand and receive care. I'm able to understand what they need at that moment, right? Sometimes my youngest daughter requires a bit more attention than the other 2. It does not mean that I'm ignoring the other two. It does not mean that I love my youngest the most. It means that at this moment in time, she's the one that needs reassurance of care and concern and compassion, empathy and sympathy, so on and so forth. That I'm providing her with what she needs at that moment. Because that's what care looks like. There are other moments in time where my son has the need, or my firstborn has the need. And so it's not that I'm playing favorites, it's that I'm concerning myself with what each of my children need. And that's going to look different because they're different people. Others would claim, no, you're playing favorites. That you're more tuned into this one than you are with that one. You show this one more love than that one. I don't know. Further on 255, most of us feel that we normally ought to help our friends, relatives, and neighbors before we concern ourselves with strangers. That's this fear thing. Those closer to us. Bias is a good thing, not a bad thing, says the care ethicist. Impartiality is the bad thing. Of course, Shrapi should occasionally give his wife flowers or something. That doesn't then require him to buy flowers for everyone he knows. He should love his wife a bit, not just differently, but more than a whole lot of other folks. The level of care and concern should be deeper than it is with, well, you all. It doesn't mean I don't care for you. It means I care for you all slightly less than I care for my wife. Why is that something to be ashamed of? Hate, anger, selfishness, 255, all these halt things. And I mean, since we're talking about it, we go ahead and throw on the three from the first Frozen movie too. People make bad choices when they're mad or scared or stressed. Once we get stressed, scared, mad's kind of covered by the angry. But put a little love their way, and you'll bring out their best, says the Fixer Upper song from the original Frozen movie. Love, care, concern. If the song is right, doesn't change people, but it may help them bring out the best in that person. They won't be mad or scared or stressed anymore because they realize there's someone else there. There's someone to help them. There's someone to care for them. Now, we do need to be very, very careful that that doesn't get taken advantage of. Again, I believe I mentioned this last time, right? If we're looking at the mother-child relationship in the traditional sense as the exemplar, as the archetype for how we should be treating everyone, love, care, concern, so on and so forth. Again, that level of care and compassion does make you vulnerable and open you up to potential hurt. We'll talk about that with regards to the enabling. And getting taken advantage of, again, with the enabling. And someone could more easily take advantage of you because you're prioritizing people and relationships. Much tougher to take advantage of someone who's prioritizing ideals of honesty because they're maintaining ideals of honesty. There's no real way to skew that or spin that. The tie of people, genuine caring results in action, actually results in doing. So there again, perhaps it's more results than intentions. Or maybe we just need to shift our understanding of what it means to intend something. An intention necessarily leads to actions. Bruner and Rayleigh, at least, and they're referencing Nell Noddings here, 258, although the carer has the primary responsibilities within a relationship, the cared for also has certain responsibilities. Noddings maintained that the cared for must complete the act initiated by the carer by recognizing himself as the recipient of care and acknowledging that in a confirming way, thus lending more towards results-based rather than intentions-based. But I really want to get to, where is this section? Right, 267, 268, really get into some of the potential issues and problems here. And remember, we're emphasizing responsibility over and above rights. On 267, exploitative relationships. A common reaction to the ethics of caring and a criticism often leveled against it by other feminists, or just other folks in general, is that caring invites the cared for to take advantage of the carer. Caring can be enabling to people who are perfectly happy to receive whatever they can, but are never willing to give. We've all run into sponges like this, who just soak up help and kindness from others, but never reciprocate. In the worst cases, caring relationships may become codependencies, one-sided relationships, in which those who are cared for develop a nearly complete reliance upon carers to take care of them and meet their needs. At what point does care and concern, empathy, sympathy, compassion, helping turn into doing for and enabling? Handouts versus hand-ups again, which I think I mentioned last time. That's a tough line. Just like the line between self-care and care for others, which they get to on page 268, we also need to make sense of moral obligations towards ourselves. I don't really want to talk about obligations and duties. I think those words are misplaced here with regards to care ethics. They're much better placed in deontology. I think Bernard and Rayleigh are sort of allowing their biases to come through here just in the language that they're using. We need to make sense of moral obligations towards ourselves. Surely there are such obligations. But as moral obligations can only arise within relationships for care ethics, this seems to require that we each somehow establish a relationship with ourselves. I mean, we are the center of the spheres, after all. It's difficult to care for others if you yourself are in need of care, unless we have some type of reciprocal, I'm caring for you, you're caring for me. But if I'm doing all the pouring out and never getting poured into, that's what's going to lead to things like burnout, which, again, is frequently mentioned with regards to motherhood. Right? Where's the time for me? I feel selfish making time for me. I should be putting everyone else, my family and so forth, above my own needs. This is psychologically awkward. One alternative might be to base my obligations of self-care upon obligations I have towards others. Thus, suppose that another person cares a great deal about me. This could then give me a duty toward that person to take good care of myself. This duty would be for my sake, but not for my sake, but for theirs, which is strange and which still cannot explain any duties of self-care I might have separate from others. There is clearly some work remaining in care ethics to make sense of the full range of moral obligations. Furthermore, and Bernard and Rayleigh don't talk about this, and it goes back again to the results versus intentions and the knowing people and trying to care for them when maybe they don't understand that that's what you're trying to do. I wonder about the concept of something like tough love. If I'm giving tough love, I'm probably attempting to emphasize the love, just in a tough way, so as to prevent enabling or something along those lines, perhaps. But the person that I'm giving this tough love to may only be receiving the tough part and not understanding the love part. Or it may be down the road a ways till they understand the love aspect. They just see the toughness at this point. Am I ethically on the hook until they understand it as love? Am I off the hook because I'm attempting to show care and compassion and so on and so forth in a way that they don't necessarily understand right now? There's an optimism here with care ethics that things will turn out okay in the end, down the road, right? That by showing the love and compassion and care and empathy and sympathy, things eventually will turn out okay, even though it may not look that way in the short term. With respect to that, I think about the drunk coworker example, right? The drunk coworker, let's say you turn them in because you care for them, you want them to get the help that they need, and you've approached them and they're not interested in hearing it from you. So you do go to the boss in the hopes that the boss will somehow get them the help they need. You kind of don't have control over what the boss then does. If the boss fires them, then you can look at statistics. People who are alcoholics who then lose their job typically dive deeper into alcoholism. I mean, this person, it's conceivable, could drink themselves to death. Are you ethically on the hook for that? That wasn't your intent, but that is the result. Or, what if that is the wake-up call they need, and they do turn their life around, eventually? Because my guess is, on the way out the door, this individual is not going to be pleased with you. Thank you so much for turning me in. I understand that you did it because you love and have care for me and concern and empathy and sympathy. They're probably not going to receive it that way. But down the road, eventually, presuming they don't drink themselves to death, they may find themselves in a recovery program, one of the steps of which is about making amends. You may get a random phone call thanking you from this person, because down the road, eventually, they recognize that thing that you did as caring. How far down the road are you on the hook? Good question, and an unclear question for care ethics. Furthermore, when I think about care ethics and I think about this role of responsibility, it reminds me of a kid's book, The Big Orange Splot. So yes, I'm going to read a kid's book to you now. Actually, I'm going to read part of a kid's book to you now, because I would like for there to be a discussion on the discussion board about what you all think about the characters in this particular book. Mr. Plumbean lived on a street where all the houses were the same. Mr. Plumbean with his sweet mustache. He liked it that way. So did everybody else on Mr. Plumbean's street. I need to scooch this over so you can see the thing. This is a neat street, they would say. Then one day, a seagull flew over Mr. Plumbean's house. He was carrying a can of bright orange paint, no one knows why, and he dropped the can, no one knows why, right over Mr. Plumbean's house. It made a big orange splot on Mr. Plumbean's house. Ooh, too bad, everybody said. Mr. Plumbean will have to paint his house again. I suppose I will, said Mr. Plumbean, but he didn't paint his house right away. He looked at the big orange splot for a long time. Then he went about his business. The neighbors got tired of seeing that big orange splot. Someone said, Mr. Plumbean, we wish you'd get around to painting your house. Okay, said Mr. Plumbean. He got some blue paint and some white paint, and that night he got busy. He painted at night because it was cooler. When the paint was gone, the roof was blue, the walls were white, and the big orange splot was still there. Then he got some more paint. He got red paint, yellow paint, green paint, and purple paint. In the morning, the other people on the street came out of their houses. Their houses were all the same, but Mr. Plumbean's house was like a rainbow. It was like a jungle. It was like an explosion. There was the big orange splot, and there were little orange splots. There were stripes. There were pictures of elephants and lions and pretty girls and steam shovels. The people said, Plumbean has popped his cork, flipped his wig, blown his stack, and dropped his stopper. They went away, muttering. That day, Mr. Plumbean bought carpenter's tools. That night, he built a tower on top of his roof, and he painted a clock on the tower. The next day, the people said, Plumbean has gushed his mush, lost his marbles, and slipped his hawser. They decided they would pretend not to notice. That very night, Mr. Plumbean got a truck full of green things. He planted palm trees, baobabs, thorn bushes, onions, and frangipani. In the morning, he bought a hammock and an alligator. When the other people came out of their houses, they saw Mr. Plumbean swinging in a hammock between two palm trees. They saw an alligator lying in the grass. Mr. Plumbean was drinking lemonade. Plumbean has gone too far. This used to be a neat street. Plumbean, what have you done to your house? The people shouted. My house is me, and I admit. My house is where I like to be, and it looks like all my dreams, Mr. Plumbean said. The people went away. They asked the man who lived next door to Mr. Plumbean to go and have a talk with him. Tell him that we all liked it here before he changed his house. Tell him that his house has to be the same as ours so we can have a neat street. And I'll stop there, finish another time. Because if I'm thinking about care ethics and about responsibilities that we have towards others, I'm wondering if Mr. Plumbean is a good neighbor or a bad neighbor. Is he being selfish by expressing himself in this way? To what extent should he consider the rest of the neighborhood, the rest of the community, in his relationship to them? Because, of course, all these things are connected. The decisions that your neighbors make do necessarily influence and impact you as a homeowner. Depending on what they do, the value of your house might be brought down, for instance. So I'll end that there because I want to start a discussion to get your thoughts on this, especially thinking about perhaps rights versus responsibilities. See you later.